January is Sunday Forum theme has been what is a progressive church? And our first week we talked about progressive language. Last week I had Lee's wonderful presentation on music in a progressive church. Today we have two representatives from Third Church talking about the history and current actions there in regard to the social gospel. And our guest, Ralph Carter, will talk about his personal journey in regard to gay rights in the Presbyterian Church. And then Ry Foy will be talking about a little bit of the history at Third and current programs and activities. And I'm curious, you've suggested that some things have been more helpful than others. And I think that would be good for us to know. Both would like a lot of interaction, but I think maybe we can wait for the question and answer period. And on a personal note, my introduction to seeking freedom for gays in the Presbyterian Church was when I was worshiping at Third, because I was a member then, back in the early 80s. And instead of a sermon, we had a gentleman coming out. And that gentleman was Ralph Carter. And it produced, I don't remember the specifics, but it produced a great deal of empathy on my part and a great deal of respect and admiration for his courage, because that was a time when being gay was viewed as a mental illness and was probably illegal in many, if not all states. So, Ralph, welcome. We'll let you start.
Probably better sit down. Oh, this is like coming home. Because I know a number of members of the church and hold them dearly in my heart. So I'm really looking forward to this dialogue. I view it as a dialogue, although you got to shut me up. So raise your hand or is there a back noise? Do I need to do something or or shut it further back?
Just shut down this microphone at the time.
Oh, hello? Is that okay?
That's good.
Okay, all right, we're good. And so Ry Foy, Dr. Foy, Ry Foy is a member of our anti-racism team and be giving a little bit of introduction, I suppose. And so let Ry start, and then he's got some great history that he'll be sharing, and then I'll do a little bit of history and then what's happening, some of the things that are happening currently.
Thanks, Ralph, and thank you, Bob, and thank you, David, for getting our. Oh yes, maybe I can just. We'll just pass it. Yeah, is that one off? So thank you, Bob, and it's great to be here. Thanks, David, for his help in getting our technology going. So my name is Ry Foy, and I'm apologetic being here because I'm trying to portray some history, and I'm not really a historian. I should know more to give a talk like this, but I thought I'd pick up some highlights about what our social ministry journey has been at Third, just as an introduction, just to set the stage. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but I think it's important to, and in your illustrious history too, in this area too, it'd be wonderful to hear about it. But I wanted to set some because I think it sets a tone for where we're coming from, where we've been at Third Church. Paul Tillich said the two most important questions you should ask as a person really is where have I come from and where am I going? And so where have I come from, I think is an important prelude to talking more about where to go from here. So I gave you a little handout here with some of the highlights. This is personal. There are many highlights that I don't know about and haven't represented here, but I wanted to say something about these few people. Charles Finney was a leading evangelist of the Second Great Awakening at the beginning of the 1800s. Our church was founded in 1827, and a few years after its founding, the person who was the minister at the time invited Finney to be in our pulpit for 6 months in 1830 to 1831. And so I associate the name Charles Finney with the Christian church in Penfield where I live. And so I associate in my mind, erroneously, that Charles Finney's theology was like the theology of modern day evangelicals. But in fact, he was quite a social justice person himself. And he did some things I just want to mention. I've mentioned a couple of them here, but he believed in education for all. So he was a real proponent of education for women and minorities equal to the education that whites got, which at the time was sort of revolutionary, very progressive. He, when he was a minister in New York, refused to serve communion to any slaveholders. He also had women lead prayer at his revivals, which were a big deal. You've probably heard about the burned out district, that you all were part of that history too, of course. But so Finney was an important figure, but I cite him now because as one of the people who set the tone for where we were going to go. But the second person I mentioned is a guy named Paul Moore Strayer. And I don't know if any of you know his name, but he was our head of staff in the early 1900s, 1903, I think it was, to 1925. So Paul Moore Strayer followed a guy named Richard Harlan, whose father was a Supreme Court justice, whose mother was the social secretary for Mrs. Coolidge and Mrs. Harding. You know, he was there was an aristocratic sort of feel to the church that Paul Moore Strayer turned on its head. And Paul Moore Strayer was really, I think, I see him as a sort of the father of where we've come since, is that he came, and I should mention this part of his biography, which I find fascinating. His wife died in childbirth 16 days before he came here to be our head minister. And he came, he brought his sister with him to take care of the baby, but he was an incredibly energetic guy, and he was a champion for unions. And think of the history at the time. This is early 1900s, and we were in the midst of the burgeoning industrial development of Rochester. Immigrants were flooding in from abroad and living in squalid conditions. And you know, at that time, that was the social justice movement. Social justice issue of the time that was huge. He went to union meetings. He marched in their parades. He even had a column in the local union newspaper that he regularly wrote, and then so that was where he was. He focused on that particular issue of social justice, but in a big way, and had a huge impact. He formed what he called a social service department at Third. At the time, he was the only minister, but he hired a social worker to be the social service department. And he was one of a few leaders in Rochester, helped form the precursor to the United Way. And so he had a very much of a outside the walls of the church focus in his ministry that was really, really impressive. And but then let me get to more modern times. We forget about Strayer because we focus more on what's happened more recently. But Hudnut, Bill Hudnut, some of you may know that name. He was our minister during the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. He retired in 1964 when the riots happened in Rochester. And so I knew about Bill Hudnut because my dad, who's a Presbyterian minister in Saratoga Springs for many years, mentioned him in his sermons and what he was doing in Rochester. So when I came to Rochester, I knew something about Third and the history from that. Besides the civil rights work, though, Hudnut was also, he was the head of staff when we had our first female elder. And then Lillian Alexander, I don't know if you know that name, but Lillian Alexander is a remarkable woman who, as an elder, initiated overtures to the General Assembly, which she had to do repeatedly before the ordination of women in ministry was her overture. She was the person responsible for that in 1955. It was adopted. And then Gene Bay, I just want to mention Gene Bay. Some of you may know Gene, he's more recent, but Gene gave a sermon at the request of members of our church, probably including Ralph, on homosexuality, the Bible, and the church. And those of us who weren't at that time really engaged in that ministry that lit a fire under us. And that was in 1986. And in 1987, we became a More Light church. And so I credit Gene very much with that, but he was boosted by giants like Ralph in the church to do that. And I won't go into more detail about the list of our current, because it's going to come up in the next slide. But I did list there both two of John Wilkinson and Rod Froman, who was such a great outreach leader for our church and so many things that they got involved in, but I won't go into details. And then I want to mention Ralph, along with Beth Laidlaw, who you all met, I think, recently, or some of you met recently, and Lori Mahoney. Those three started our anti-racism project and team, and were really had been incredibly persistent and have driven our church in a leadership way that they deserve a lot of credit for. And then Rebecca Seegers is our first called female head of staff, so I added her to the list. And I forgot that the first female called minister to our church was Mary Carol Shadle, when Conrad Massa was our head of staff. And the second was, as you know, Pat Youngdahl, who became your minister. So that's just a little bit of history. And I want you to go to the next slide now. And this is the second page where I just listed what are our social justice ministries. And I list this, and I mentioned that history, forgive me for going that long on it, but it's where we've been. And it shows you, I don't want to get stuck in those things. We didn't become union, wasn't our main focus for our history, no. But at the time, it was the leading social justice issue of the time. And it needs to be our inspiration to be courageous enough, bold enough, as you all have been, but to be involved in the social justice ministry of our time. What is it? Where should our focus be? And we need to be as courageous and bold and prophetic as they were. And so I think you and your history, if you look back at it, will have similar stories that strengthen you in terms of going forward with what is currently of importance. The second slide, which I'm just going to mention briefly, this is some of what we're doing now. And we put it under the headings of hunger, housing, education, advocacy, and collaboration. And I don't think I'll read through them all, but you can see them on your handout. And I've left off many. Ralph probably knows many that I don't have in there that I should give justice to. But that was my list of the ones I'm more familiar with. And so thank you for listening to that history. And maybe we'll hear some of yours as we have our discussion. But let me turn it to Ralph.
Oh, thank you, Ryan. Well, you're more of a historian than you think. This is really, I think it's really great.
Actually, correct. Bill Young wrote a history of our church at the 175th anniversary in 2002 or 3. And what that information I got came from Bill. And so I owe that. I got to credit him with that.
I really love having the names of some of the leaders in Third Church over its history, especially in terms of its progressive history. We have this painting of Charles Finney. It's in the upstairs. If you've ever been at Third Church and you've seen the painting, his eyes follow you. So it's like
scare you.
Oh,
They're frightening.
just a little bit intimidating. But the more I learn about Charles Finney for his day, he was really, and I didn't know that about the slaveholders.
Yeah.
That he would not, it's like there's certain standards that have to be met, and he was firm in his conviction, and thank goodness, because those are the kernels of trees that can grow ultimately. And then Paul Moore Strayer, we can't forget Walter Rauschenbusch.
Oh, right.
Right? You want to say something there?
Well, Yeah, thanks, Ralph. I forgot to mention Rauschenbusch, who many of you know, the primary author of the Social Gospel, writing at the time of the early 1900s when Strayer was at our church. They were friends. They lived near each other. They took walks together, and so Rauschenbusch was sort of the author. And Strayer's ministry was the application of the social justice ministry. And so the two of them working together was really powerful. And I should, there's another little tidbit. I'm getting carried away, but they also sponsored a church for non-church goers in a theater in downtown Rochester called the Victoria Theater. But it must have been a big place because they drew up to 2,500 people to those services. But this was specifically meant to be for immigrants who didn't identify with one of our churches, but were Christians. And so the more interesting history, but Rauschenbusch is a giant in social justice ministries.
Yeah, Walter Rauschenbusch, and I'm starting to read some of his work, and my goodness, as a thought leader, he was just totally amazing. Lillian Alexander comes into play in my story. Her story comes into play in my story. Gene Bay, he told me years later that when I came out to him, that he started receiving letters from my mother, and with the idea of, well, you can help my son change, and so that he doesn't have to be admitted into a mental institution. And it was so I'm sure he went through an awful lot, but he graciously did not share this with me, because I was getting stuff from my mother weekly in her 6-page letters. She was concerned for my soul. Anyway, that's another whole thing. But there's so much to share, and so a lot of this timeline is here. So it's their framing. In order to tell your story as a church, as a movement, for whatever you're working on, framing is so important. So even when there's bad news at a General Assembly, for instance, there are kernels of good news. And so what we need to do is to lift up the remnant from the tree, the root of Jesse, story in the Bible. That is important, because we need hope. So without hope, the people perish, as the saying goes, and it's true. But I wanted to, so what I want to focus on with some stories is not only in terms of the LGBT movement, but also the major lessons learned that I got out of it, of the movement, which then apply to anti-racism work. In my thinking. So first of all, we need to know who our saints are. So when I moved to Rochester from the South, I was not escaping Jim Crow like my Black friends, because I saw it growing up. I remember the segregation. And I remember the riots we had in our little town when all of the Black teachers, when we integrated, lost their jobs except for one who needed to be on the faculty at the high school to teach Black history. But no Black coaches for the athletes to look up to, no teachers of English or literature or anything else. There were none. There was only one in the high school. So you can imagine the disenfranchisement and what that's like. There's a lot could go into about that, but it's important to know who our saints are. So in terms of the LGBT, locally, Virginia Davidson, hands down. She was like, because we're Presbyterians for Gay Concerns, which became PLGC, Lesbian and Gay Concerns, which had chapters in presbyteries that would form. And so in 1979, when I moved to Rochester from the South, Um, um, that was after the 78 report where Jenny Davidson from Downtown Church, had been asked to chair the General Assembly Task Force on homosexuality. It might be a slightly different naming of that, but that was it. And so the recommendation got completely overturned, and many of you, I'm sure most of you know that whole story. And there was one little piece, in the minority report, original majority report that got moved to an addendum about civil rights. And that comes into play in the story of Genesee Valley and this church and in the movement locally. But Jenny Davidson was huge. And I also, Dee Miller, is a member of this church, because Dee hosted in her apartment on Culver Road facing Cobbs Hill the monthly potlucks, which included other people you will know, Bruce Billman, who had the driest humor and is the funniest guy going once you get to know him. And then he had three besties, three women that I call the three wise women. It's in my nomenclature. It was Margaret Stoltman, who lived on Frederick Douglass Street, in Cornhill. Lily Jules, who was just, you remember her, and then Kay Wroblewski. And these three women and Bruce would go to like every presbytery meeting, every synod meeting. And so I don't think Bruce ever did, but the women were knitting and crocheting and following along what's going on to make sure that if anything came up, that there's something they need to be speaking about in terms of social justice, someone, at least one voice would be there. But then also I list, so they were like fabulous. And these are mostly allies, which was huge for me, feeling separated from my biological family. I learned the language of family of choice. So it's family of origin, family of choice. And so these are people near and dear. Chuck Collins, Pat Moran, Cap and Bruce McEwen, whose son became the voice of doctors in the state of Hawaii when HIV/AIDS was happening. But he grew up in Henrietta in the John Calvin Church there, which is a Morlite church. And then Bill Yolton and Diane Inkster. Bill was on the presbytery staff, as was Jim Rice, and he's another one, which was and his wife Lucille. But Diane Inkster was the first bisexual person I ever met, and we argued back and forth, and she convinced me, that this is me, this is who I am. But then Gail and Anthony Ricciuti, and then Rose, Rosemary Mitchell. So every time I drive down Binghamton, I think of Rose Mitchell. Barb and Hugh and then folks in Geneva Presbytery. Barb and Hugh Alderson, who lived in, they come to Rochester a lot because there was not much where they were, but the Jim Gerling, who was the longtime pastor of the Geneva Presbyterian Church, and their Morlite church there. Sam Edwards, executive presbyter, was just fabulous for Geneva Presbytery. Dan Smith, who was at the Geneva Church, associate pastor, was coming out, I should say, and then moved to West Hollywood, California, to the West Hollywood Presbyterian Church, where a lot of the Morlite gatherings in California were being held. Gathering community. Who are the folks that can support you in what you're doing is really important. Who are the people that are your trusted companions on the journey that you can go to for support and solace, because they're going to be slings and arrows of outrageous misfortune that happen. The other important thing really is listening for the call for action, a call for taking steps forward. So on the early on, in the early 80s, the entire denomination was doing major capital fundraising, and it was going to be a third, a third, a third of all the monies raised locally for Genesee Valley. 1/3 would go to the General Assembly, 1/3 to Senate, and then 1/3 stays local. Jim Rice came to the PLGC gathering and says, I think, this was after the 78 report, mind you, right? He comes to our gathering and says, you should apply for some of these funds. So we said, okay, we're going to have, I forgot if it was a 3-year, does anybody remember? It was a 3-year or 5-year project, but it was like thousands of dollars. I think we asked for like $5,000 to create an ecumenical gay, at that point, the language was gay and lesbian, civil rights advocacy network in upstate New York. And that was all based on the addendum of Jenny Davidson's report, what became the addendum, but was the majority report in terms of civil rights. Now that, weave that together. And what was very interesting about that was that, okay, the only way we thought that the Presbytery would approve it, $5,000 back in 1980 or 81, time frame is a lot of money. And said, okay, we got to have some accountability in there. So the three wise women and the wise man suggested, well, why don't we say that we have to report to the Presbytery? I think it was every 6 months. And then they said, oh, we're good for once a year. But it started out every 6 months, and Presbytery bought it. Well, okay, they're going to stand before us, tell us what we're doing. If we don't like it, then, we're going to have a word to say. And that's pretty much what happened. But so I mentioned listening for the call, because as we were, okay, we're having our first one. It's going to be at First Presbyterian Church, Pittsford. And so let's have a Bible study for like 20 minutes, and then we'll have a personal story. And then I forgot there was a third part. It's always have to do it in threes, So Bruce Billman said, I'll do the Bible study. And then one of the other ones, Gail Raschuti, did a Bible study. And it was fabulous. There's really good stuff. But they needed somebody to tell the first story. I was the youngest thing there. I mean, I was right out of undergraduate school, and I was not out. I was not out at church. I was not out at work, certainly not at work, because I was on my own, baby, and I'm not going to lose that job. And so, but I prayed about it. I said, who else is going to do this? Who else? Because there's mostly allies in the group. And so I said, I got to do this. So then I said, okay, if I'm going to do this, with integrity, I've got to come out to the pastors of the church. So one thing leads to another. But you got to first listen to the call and then respond to the call. And then how am I going to navigate this? And who were my trusted companions? So I had my companions already, but I needed to talk to the church, talk to the pastors at least. And then, so I came out to each one separately. And to my surprise, to a person, they said, we love you, Ralph. We love. Anyway, it was good. I get emotional. But and here's another lesson, right? We are our own obstacle. You hear what I'm saying? We can move mountains. We do not know the power that each person in this room has and online. We have a lot of power, and it's the power of being authentic, being yourself, knowing yourself, trusting yourself, trusting God, and trusting your backup, your besties. Who's there with me that can help guide me or give me advice or correct, language I'm using or whatever, give me suggestions. But that's, but the sharing of the power of story, like, Janie Spar talked about that, right? I mean, it's, oh my gosh, story. Have your elevator speech. And have your churches. What is my church all about? What are Presbyterians all about? So we had Create Justice. And so by this time, Chuck Collins, who became a member of this church, you remember Chuck, came out, amicable divorce from his wife because he learned that he was gay. He actually helped me come out at Third Church, Chuck did, because wise people before I arrived, after the 78 report said that BLPGC was forming, they went to I think it was 8 congregations maybe. Does anybody know the number? I think it was about 8 that might consider becoming a more light church. And so Downtown Church was the first one. Bless your heart. I think the example of a Jenny Davidson in this congregation, but Downtown Church, and then so they came to Third Church, and the only thing Third Church could do at that beginning was we're going to agree to talk about this within the year. Carol Quallett, I didn't mention, was on session. A year is up. And she reminds Gene Bay, who was pastor, that if Gene, we made this promise and commitment, and we put it in writing in a letter to Presbyterians for Lesbian Gay Concerns. We're gonna study this. What are we gonna do? Session was terrified of actually living up to what they said they were going to do. So what they formed was a non-announced, a secret, sworn to secrecy study group for a year that would study all aspects of human sexuality, because it was too much of a hot potato to talk about gay and lesbian sexuality by itself. So we're going to enlarge it. We talked about abortion. They talked about premarital sex, which is all great. Ended up being great. It's amazing how God works. So abortion, premarital sexuality, what happens when your spouse dies and you're in your 70s, 80s, and you find love? How do you deal with grandchildren? Recognizing sexuality. We're all sexual beings. That's a gift from God. How are we, So that was one. There were about 4 or 5 topics, and I still was not out in the congregation. So even with that small group, I was such a scaredy cat. That's just how I operate. Believe it or not, I'm a scaredy cat. So I asked Chuck Collins if he would come and speak to the group so I could sort of gauge how the group is. And he did a fabulous job. Does anybody remember Dr. Jim Stewart? Anybody? Jim was a physician of physicians, and a member of the esteemed member of the congregation, Boy Scouts, Eagle Scout, the whole thing. Well, Jim was on this task force, and so he asked Chuck. He says, Chuck, what are we, the biology doesn't seem to work for me. I don't understand the biology of same-gender people falling in love. And Chuck's response, which totally amazed Jim, was, people don't fall in love because of body parts. Jim, people fall in love because of what's in their heart. Blew Jim away. And it really helped him to find his voice as a physician, to go into a lot of different studies and, the psychological and everything else. But he became a huge advocate. But it's listening for the call. It's entering another lessons learned is don't be afraid, but be prepared as much as you can, and enter into brave space, knowing that you need to be brave because you don't know one doesn't know what the ramifications are going to be ultimately and you hope for the best, and you have to trust God. So the way I think of it, and be willing to step out in faith and take risks. I am not a big risk taker, believe it or not, but I'm learning how to do that, and we all can learn how to do that. I'm convinced if I can do some of this, then all of us can. The other piece, the other lesson learned in all of this work, and I want to hear stories on all of these different points, anything that people would like to share, but the power of vulnerability. If we're willing to bare our soul and share our story, people can connect with the authenticity of what we're saying. That's why everybody in this room that I know, where you have shared some of your journey, acknowledging that we are not perfect human beings, we make mistakes, but we regret that. We say we're sorry, and then we heal. We try to make amends and to heal. The power of vulnerability is hugely important. I had no idea until I was sharing my story at the First Presbyterian Church of Pittsford. Didn't know a lot of people there, and that Create Justice. The other one lesson learned was that when we were starting the 7-year dialogue of 7 years at Third Church of becoming a more like church, was so I'm not on the outside looking in through the interpretation of people going to session meetings and so forth. But one of the discussions, I wanted to have a support group in the church. I'm not going to be here by myself. I'm not going to be the only gay person in this congregation. There's got to be others. So let's create sanctuary within the sanctuary. Well, the argument at session was, we can't have a support group. Support implies that we want to offer support for gay and lesbian people. Why don't we call it a discussion group? But we insisted on support, which makes sense, right? And then other thing we wanted to do, and this was when Pat Youngdahl was actually our staff person for this ad hoc group it was reported that, we wanted to publicize in the Empty Closet newspaper that we're having a professionally led group, that was meeting twice a month. And it was being led by a social worker, a member of the congregation, Carol Quallage, and we had eventually a man and a woman. So it was both, and one was gay and one was not. So, and so when Session first heard about, we can't publicize it, shall we? But when I heard about the idea that it might not be publicized, I was horrified. How can you can't do this. Pat Youngdahl says, never let anyone else define what you are and are not going to do. With God's help, you'll find a way. Because even if the session doesn't do it, an example was with the session, if the session doesn't authorize it, all that means is that we can't publicize it using the church newsletter. But putting something into the Empty Closet or elsewhere is up to us. And even if they say you can't do it at the church property, guess what? Someone's home. So there is a way. You have to get creative sometimes. We didn't have to, but the whole kernel of this was don't let anyone else define the limits of your power, because only you can do that. Another one was, I sort of alluded to it early, the power of 2 or 3. Jesus said, what did Jesus say about 2 or 3 people? Yeah, gathered in my name, right? Then I am there also. And I've really learned that lesson. I joined a nonprofit during COVID. and I'm attending Zoom meetings while COVID is happening, and I rely on a lot of visual for communication purposes and understanding where people are really coming from. And it was disaster for me, really, ultimately, because I didn't understand what people were really saying or what they meant, but they weren't saying it verbally. It was nonverbal, but you don't get that with Zoom. So I didn't understand, and I had no one on that board who was could give me trusted feedback. So I really advocate that whatever we're doing, either as individuals or as a congregation, always pair up so that you can get the direct, sometimes harsh feedback that we need so that we can correct our language or respect for other people whose life experiences may be very different from ours, right? So I just found that to be hugely important. Another one is connecting with other institutions as an institution, connecting with institutions. The work at General Assembly was just huge in that where we found the most support, and I want to hear from the TAMP's story too. I mean, but for me, it was women's organizations, huge, because women know what it's like to be subjugated and dismissed and objectified and all of that. So there are a lot of parallels, right, on this journey. So the Voices Sophia was huge because the wisdom literature in the Bible and the feminine, the voice of the feminine counteracts the dominating kind of narrative, which you can see in parts of the Old Testament, especially, and that needs to be corrected. So the Voices of Sophia were huge for us, I think, at General Assembly because it really helped there, but also the National Black Presbyterian Caucus. We would go to their luncheons, and a little awkward at first until people get to know each other. But then when you start telling stories, Black Presbyterians know more than anybody what it's like to be not understood. You got report after report after report over going back to the 50s and the civil rights era. And where have we implemented that? We really haven't. Now they're making serious efforts, but they weren't a long time ago. So we mentioned Presbyterian women, and then we started having this discussion at More Like Presbyterians about, well, what about the Presbyterian men? We can't let them off the hook. So I convinced Michael Adey that he and I would go to New Orleans to the national gathering of Presbyterian men. And we had this book with David Kopay, the athlete. It came out as gay, and I think he was a football player. We had several books, gay themed, gay lesbian themed, all different topics, children's, and everything. And that book got stolen. But it was the Black men, the Latino men, not so much some of the older Asian men, but the younger Asian men. Oh, yes, they understood what we were talking about. They were very much allies. I was blown away how brave these Black men, leaders in the denomination were. Not only at that gathering, but at General Assembly. They began to really speak up. And it was just incredible and really urging other men to look at things from a more human, in a more human manner. So let's open this up. Shower stoles. That was huge. Yeah, for the ordination issue. Yeah. Absolutely. Martha Gilloret and Tammy Baldwin. I can't remember her last name. Yeah, but they were And so a number of members of Downtown Church and several from Third Church and others at Calvary St. Andrews, then I'll have showers that were mostly made for them, which is so touching that that friends would and other members of the church would do that for people who were providing lay leadership in the church. So moving to the anti-racism piece specifically, there are often a lot of parallels, but I want to lift up a person that I met, Sharon Jacobson, who's a bisexual. Is it true bisexual? No, biracial woman who, when she was going to the divinity school, was not accepted by the Black Caucus at Colgate Rochester Crozier, and not accepted by queer people. Didn't feel accepted, and she's also is heavy physically and has some health issues associated with that. So there was like body image acceptance and all. So she was like 3 strikes, kind of thing. This woman was amazing. We became friends. She was one of the only people living on the campus on the Hill. And I came and visited her, and we spent hours in her rocking chairs on her little porch, talking about her story, but also her journey. And right around that time, Empire State Pride Agenda was doing marriage equality and gay civil rights. And so they were dividing up different. There was a Pride in Labor. There was a group from the Empire State working on labor issues, the labor community. Then there was one called Pride in the Pulpit. And there was Pride in My Family. There were several. It was a brilliant strategy. So they wanted to, they were offering to have some folks from the state come to different parts of the state regarding Pride in the Pulpit. And I was involved with Interfaith Advocates for LGBT people. And they asked me, so I said, well, through the work of the Presbytery Project for Regional Civil Rights Advocacy Ecumenical Network, we were able to get 75 clergy to come to the Divinity School specifically to talk about gay civil rights in New York State from a theological perspective. And I am not one to MC something like that. You would never want me to do that. I know where my skills are and where they aren't, and certainly not in that. I would take way too much time and would not be a dictator, and sometimes you need to be. So I asked Sharon Jacobson if she would do that. I was able to convince her to facilitate that, and she did an amazing job. She then started Tawapano Unity Fellowship Church. Carl Bean, I think, Miss Ricky, you were part of that congregation, right? And this is amazing to me because I know there'd been like house churches and so forth, and people can talk about that, but when we were doing the 50 years of Stonewall at the Rundell Library, I was asked to be involved in that, and it was very difficult to how do we represent the true and authentic Black experience of LGBTQ queer people in the Black community, who may not be accepted in the congregation that they grew up in. So folks, that congregation was hugely important in helping share some of those stories. But yeah, great. So there's been a lot here, a little bit of a data dump. I will be sharing follow up. There's a lot of really great talks and conversations, movies happening this month into February. that if any of it interests you, I know Nancy is encouraging folks. You may want to speak about it, but coming up. But let's open this up to just general feedback, conversations, questions, stories.
As you were talking, Ralph, I was thinking about how you being in a church that embraced you and was progressive helped you probably at work to make inroads at Xerox and help other people feel more comfortable in that work setting. Is that right?
It did eventually happen. It did happen. And it was really the church that helped me, that helped give me that. You're absolutely right. So I joined.
I'm thinking of our kids who grew up in this church, and it's just accepted to them that, we are all equal and we should all be treated that way. And the fact that you found that in your church probably helped you bring that other places in your life.
Just to add a little bit of information about that All May Freely Serve, even as we were struggling to bring about a change in the Presbyterian denomination, Janie led us all in really thinking about the all of that all may freely serve, and including and racism in that. So that was, it really became part of what that all may freely serve advocated for. And just a sec. Forgive me. Oh, I wanted to say, as Ralph has moved on to taking what he learned and using it for anti-racism, Janie, in case you don't all know, has become very active as an advocate, kind of reversing her position as an advocate for trans rights, and has done some marvelous things, really, especially again in the churches, but medically, the organization that she supports and works for a lot is one where people go to have procedures and also get counseling as they do that.
Could I just share that in follow-up, that there is an overture that Downtown Church might want to look at. It's Overture 9, and you can find it on PC. I actually have sent a PD. We have a PDF of it that we can send out to you, right, Bob? And so look it over. It's the Presbytery of the Cherokee Presbytery, which is interesting because that's indigenous largely, and so that overture affirms the importance of gender affirming healthcare, which is certainly under attack all over the place. That's why about 200 people a month are moving to Rochester, because we have healthcare here.
Can you tell us some of the activities of the anti-racism team?
All right. So, okay. Nancy, you want to share Monday? Would you like to share that?
Well, there's an MLK event happening at the Eastman Theater Monday morning at 10. And a number of us, Ralph and I, are on a Presbytery group called the Racial Justice, Peace, and Advocacy. I may have left out a
Working group.
And we're working on anti-racism. And it tickles me to think that every morning when I wake up, I look at a clock on my bedstand that says out and equal, which is an organization Ralph and I were part of in the late 90s, I believe.
Right.
So, yeah, I look at that and think about that. But the anti-racism group is working to bring, to help churches create policies, anti-racism policies, to educate the congregations. We've got a lot of stuff coming up. And so that's a very cool thing to be involved with.
Yes, there. So that's in the morning. Early afternoon, there's Being Black in America, which is the local, includes Kim Smith, who just left she was on city council. She's getting involved in vocal, and she was one of the people that are interviewed in an internationally acclaimed documentary of Black Rochesterians. You need to see it. And actually, if the filmmaker is invited, you can have your own conversation. But this is going to be really good to see how it works. But then there's the Pittsford community. The nonprofit is having a poetry slam on Wednesday. I'm involved in Citizen Action now, and they're doing economic justice. So if folks that are interested in equity, in pay equity, having a living wage, having millionaires and billionaires actually contributing financially to the public good, rather than their own personal coffers, then that's part of that work. Albany, the trips to Albany, there's one coming up and January 26th. All of these I'll include, but there's Communities Not Cages. So it's looking at specific legislations so that we can do some of the work to eliminate slavery in New York, which actually in the exception clause of the Constitution, which was the 13th Amendment nationally, the exception clause that slavery is eliminated in all these 50 states, right? I remember that part, but the exception clause, which immediately follows that same sentence, says that except for those who have been convicted of a crime and are in prison. So you are considered a slave by the state of New York. I did not know that. Once I understood that, it made a lot of sense. But anyway, yes.
You've been asking, had your hand up about that.
I have a question. One of the things noted on this paper is that in 1997, presbyteries approved, and then I can't read the number very well, but fidelity in marriage and chastity in singleness.
Mhm.
And I remember at the time I was an elder at First Presbyterian Church of Brockport. And I remember at the time just feeling like it was from the dark ages. And I wanted to know, just because I don't know, how that, it says presbyteries approve, but was that an overture from a presbytery, or how did that come about?
Anybody like to share that? I mean, there were several here who were it was, overtures typically come through the presbyteries, as you know. But there are forces in organizations. So one is the lay committee, that received a ton of money. If you remember J. Howard Pugh, Pugh was a member of the church in the Philadelphia area and was in oil. And his foundation donated a lot of money, which underwrote everything that the lay committee was doing, which is totally anti-gay, anti-women. It was anti a lot of stuff. And so there were a number of presbyteries that are conservative minded that bought into that language, and they developed this whole idea and encouraged it.
And what just a little bit of a follow-up, and what was your response to that in 97. I wasn't sure exactly how organized Third Church was at that time.
Yeah, well, we became a more like church. First of all, we studied for 7 years. So by
Right.
1987, so when we got to 97, we had had 10 years under our belt where we were actually, and I can remember this, we were doing was it every year or every other year, training for church leaders, for all of our elders and all that. So we had been doing a lot of education internally, and we also formed a more like committee in addition to the support group. And so we had a committee of session, authorized by session, to help it implement its commitment to more life. So Third Church was getting organized, and we were following a lot of the time the lead of Downtown Church, because downtown was in Calvary St. Andrews. But I have to say, Presbytery, every single time any gay or lesbian issue came before the Presbytery, they supported it. Now, they wouldn't talk about it a lot. They were almost Quaker, but they passed it. And Synod of the Northeast as well. The Synod of the Northeast, the whole Northeast was behind this movement. Yeah.
We need to close up, but thank you so much for all the background and the insights and the things to look for support. Next week, we will have, yeah. Next week, Windsor will be talking to us about racism, and he mentions an incident with a water fountain in the South. So I'll be very curious to hear about that.
Mm.
And I may add my own Southern water fountain story. So,
Mm.
come and join us next week. And thank you both so much, and for all your time and effort and thoughtfulness, and your witness. Thank you.